Prologue. Antoine. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling me away from the endless YouTube scrolling. I glanced at the name on the screen, Jeff. He was probably calling to see if I had any weekend plans, as per usual. I sighed and hit accept, bracing myself for whatever adventure he was about to rope me into this time. "Antoine, what are you up to this weekend?" Jeff asked eagerly before I even had a chance to say hello. "Nothing so far, just hanging around the apartment." "Why? What do you have in mind?" I replied warily. Jeff's ideas of fun usually involved more physical activity than I cared for, but in all honesty I needed it. I was less healthy than I wished these days. "Perfect. Pack your bags. We're going camping," he announced, leaving me no options, which was fine, I guess. Like I said, I could use it. I groaned inwardly. "Camping? Jeff, you know I'm not really an outdoorsy type of guy, nor in the right health, and I don't want to hold your back, you know? Come on. It'll be great. Me, you, Joel, and James are all going up to the Upper Peninsula for some hiking, fishing, stargazing. The works! It's the perfect weekend to get out of the city for a bit. And last of all, I know you work yourself too hard. You have to come." I did have to admit, escaping to the woods for a couple days sounded more appealing than lounging around my apartment. But actual camping? We're renting a couple campsites at a state park right on Lake Superior. It has toilet facilities and fire rings, all the amenities. Jeff reassured me. I pictured myself wrestling with a tent, fighting off mosquitoes and trying to start a campfire with damp firewood. "I don't know, Jeff." "Antoine, don't be a bitch, come on. When was the last time you did anything remotely adventurous or spontaneous? This is exactly what you need to break out of your routine for a weekend. Plus the forecast is clear skies." He had a point. I did feel like I'd been in a bit of a rut lately. My days blurred together in a haze of work and Netflix. A change of scenery could be nice. And it had been too long since I'd seen Jeff and the others outside of our usual meets. I hesitated for a moment before conceding. "All right, you've convinced me. I'm in. Yes, pack your bag. I'll pick you up tomorrow morning at." Jeff whooped excitedly before hanging up. "Well," I thought to myself as I set my phone back down, no going back now. I spent the rest of the afternoon getting my things in order, packing clothes, toiletries, a book, pillows and blankets into my backpack. This was about to be so far out of the norm for me. I knew from experience that Jeff was an early riser, while I usually hit snooze a few times too many. How would I survive 2 full days of roughing it in the wilderness? Morning came sooner than expected. After only a few fitful hours of sleep, my alarm blared at 6:30. I dragged myself out of bed to finish getting ready, exhaustion already setting in at the prospect of the weekend ahead. By 7:45, I had dressed in some basketball shorts and band shirt, packed a small cooler of snacks and drinks, and was mentally psyching myself up to leave the comfort of my home. Right at 8 o'clock, I heard Jeff's car pull up outside, his bass letting the neighbors know he was here as well. I shouldered my backpack and grabbed the cooler before heading downstairs. Jeff waved at me from the driver's seat, already eager and animated for the trip. I tossed my things in the back and climbed into the passenger seat. We pulled away, blaring the classic tunes of Mudvayne and Subtronics. Before we left the lot, the jokes began, and comparison on takes of the newest films. Between these exchanges, Jeff's subwoofers ate the silence between us. James and Joel were planning to drive up together from Canton and would meet us at the campground tonight. Our destination was Tahquamenon Falls State Park, over 4 hours north and every inch scenic and surreal. The morning traffic was steady as we left the city behind. Once the hustle and bustle of cities fell away as we crossed into nature's bounty, the oaks, pines and tall grass covered either side of the blacktop. I watched the landscape change through the window. After about an hour, we stopped for gas and snacks in Perry. I took the chance to stretch my legs while Jeff topped off the tank. Back in the truck, country roads hugged the landscape as farms and forests rolled by. Our conversation eventually came to a silence. The beauty of the outdoors left both of us in a trance. Jeff drove while I absorbed the sights as the cars nearby became fewer and fewer. A bathroom break around the halfway point kept us moving. By early afternoon, the trees were thicker on either side of the highway. Nothing but nature as far as the eye could see. I found myself relaxing into the scenery. The edibles were kicking in, and the first initial wave of paranoia faded into a relaxation that was aided by the clean air. Jeff followed GPS directions off the main roads onto narrower trails. The sun was still in its zenith, bathing the towering pines in orange pastel hues. The whole thing felt like being in the middle of a Bob Ross painting, We rolled down the windows, feeling farther removed from civilization with each passing mile. Finally, a sign came into view, Taquamenon Falls. We made it. The ride seemed shorter than expected. 4 hours seemed to be the perfect amount of time to prepare my mind for this. Jeff steered the truck down the winding dirt path. A few minutes later, yellow glows emerged between the trees ahead. "That must be them," Jeff announced, accelerating slightly. We pulled into the campsite to find James and Joel already setting up their tent in the clearing. Chapter 1. The sun was hovering just above the trees as Antoine and Jeff pulled into the campsite. James and Joel were securing the final stakes of their tent, while a small fire crackled in the stone pit. "You made it!" James called out, as they began to unpack. Jeff stretched his long limbs. "Drive wasn't too bad, though I think this one's ready to call it a night already." He nodded at Antoine playfully. Yeah. "I know, but this time I only slept for a half hour or so. I was mostly awake the whole ride." His eyes still showed signs the edibles held their sway. Antoine smiled, taking in the serene setting as the others laughed. The shore of a vast lake glimmered in the distance beyond thick pine woods. Only a few other sites were occupied around the looping dirt path, leaving a sense of solitude. DNR, aka the fun Nazis, did their rounds just as the four came to slap hands and do formal greetings. Antoine and Joel had never met before. James did the honours. "Hey, Ant, this is Joel, good buddy of mine." "Hey there, stranger, how are you?" Ant said playfully. "Can't lie, I'm glad to be out of the city and back in the wild again," Joel replied, giving a firm but quick handshake. It seemed to be a good start to a good thing for all involved. They were just grateful for the moment it was just beginning to cool for the afternoon. A slight breeze blowing in from Lake Superior, carrying the perfume of the pines with it. Antoine and Jeff began unloading their gear, tent, sleeping bags, crates of provisions. Once everyone had their tents up, Jeff and Antoine shared a six-man. James and Joel had their own. The four worked efficiently in the fading light, the clearing now looking more like a village of tarp and tent. As darkness fell, they checked the weather report on Jeff's phone. "Shit, it's saying there's a chance of rain all weekend." "I was really hoping to tube the river tomorrow," Jeff grumbled. James seemed the least affected, just happy to be in the wilderness with his friends. "Fuck the rain, son. We're here to bond with nature. Let's just drink a few beers, eat some food, and get a real fire going. Not that pussy shit you got going on over there." The group laughed a cacophony that echoed through the campground. Somewhere nearby, a DNR truck took notice of the group engaging in the most offensive cardinal sin, fun. Joel grabbed a bag of burgers from the cooler. "Rain or shine, we're still having a good time. Who wants dinner?" "And I'll second those beers. Can you pass me one?" Jeff did, but both he and Antoine declined one for themselves. Both usually drank on occasions like this, but neither liked the coppery taste of Bud Light, which happened to be the flavour of the night, along with a few loose shots of Fireball whiskey, a cinnamon shotgun blast to the senses of one who isn't prepared for the experience. Joel joked about his culinary skills, yet yielded a tasty bounty on the grill. None of the burgers were exactly well done, but no one complained. If anything, the cheese complemented the palate, and the hot dogs were made to perfection. Grill marks running down a sizzling surface of America's finest Grade A beef. They passed around a joint for dessert, chatting and watching the northern sky reveal its rich display of stars between patches of thin white clouds. Antoine, Jeff, James, and Joel had just finished cleaning up after their festivities around the grill, as the scent of high-quality weed still permeated the air. The fire pit crackled, sending sparks dancing into the twilight. "All right, fellas," Jeff said, pulling a small, unassuming package from his cooler. "Who's ready for the main event?" Antoine raised an eyebrow. "Are those mushroom bars?" Jeff nodded, grinning. "The very same. These bad boys are potent too, and I thought we'd give them a night of our attention. Perfect way to unwind and really take in the wilderness." "Come on, you know I'm right." James and Joel exchanged glances, a mix of excitement and apprehension flashing in their eyes. "Why not?" James said, breaking into a smile. "We're here to have fun after all. Plus, I don't think me and Antoine have tripped together before. Joel, well, he's pretty much a psychonaut. I'm sure he's down." Joel's grinning face looked up from his current project. Connecting the Bluetooth to his phone, it's charged only half, but plenty enough to cap off the night. Joel chuckled. "Just as long as we don't end up running naked through the woods looking for Sasquatch." He remembered the shop in Paradise that sold hide-and-seek champion shirts. each a different variation of Sasquatch holding up a victory trophy. Antoine laughed, shaking his head. No promises, man. Out here, who knows? They gathered around the picnic table, Jeff carefully unwrapping the chocolate bars infused with psilocybin. He passed one to each of them, and they all took a moment to inspect the treat before taking their first bite. Here's to a night we won't forget, Antoine said, raising his chocolate in a mock toast. They all clinked their bars together, a ritualistic gesture, before biting in. The chocolate was rich and smooth, with just a hint of the earthy mushroom taste. They chewed thoughtfully, savouring the moment. As they finished, they settled around the fire pit, leaning back in their camping chairs and watching the flames dance. Now we wait, Jeff said, leaning back and closing his eyes. The others followed suit, letting the warmth of the fire and the sounds of the forest envelop them. About 30 minutes later, Antoine was the first to notice the change. The edges of the trees seemed to shimmer, the leaves rustling with a life of their own. He glanced at Jeff, who was staring wide-eyed at the sky, a look of pure wonder on his face. Do you see that? Jeff whispered, pointing upwards. The stars. They're moving. Antoine looked up, and sure enough, the stars appeared to be swirling, forming intricate patterns against the night sky. In truth, it was the passage of clouds giving the illusion of movement. But to the stoned men, it was a show put on by the universe. He felt a bubble of laughter rising in his chest, unable to contain it. The others soon joined in, their laughter echoing through the forest. James leaned forward, eyes squinted against the fire. Guys, the lake, it's like a flat surface of wet granite. Look at the colours in the fire. The flames seemed to pulse with vibrant hues, shifting from orange to blue to green. The logs crackled and popped, sending showers of multicoloured sparks into the air. Joel was gazing into the distance, a serene smile on his face. I think I can see the trees breathing, he said softly. Like they're alive. I'm serious. Don't you see their life force? They spent the next few hours exploring their altered perceptions, pointing out the strange and beautiful things they saw. The trees seemed to dance, the stars twinkled with a newfound brightness, and the fire pit was a source of endless fascination. Antoine found himself mesmerized by the patterns in the dirt, tracing them with his fingers and marveling at the intricate designs. Jeff was lying on his back, giggling at the clouds that seemed to morph into fantastical creatures. James and Joel were having an animated conversation about the meaning of life, their words flowing with an ease and clarity that felt almost profound. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the hours slipping by in a haze of laughter and wonder. It wasn't until nearly 2 a.m. that they started to come down, the world gradually returning to its normal state. The fire had burned low, the embers glowing softly in the darkness, all out of firewood, and none willing to go retrieve more. The fire had outlived its usefulness for the night. Man, that was something else, Antoine said, still smiling as he stretched out his legs. I love having a good trip around good people. Jeff nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Definitely a night to remember. I'm glad you came with us. Just as they were about to call it a night, they heard the distant sound of an engine. Antoine frowned, sitting up and peering into the darkness. Is that? The others listened, and sure enough, the unmistakable sound of a vehicle grew louder. Moments later, headlights cut through the trees, and a Department of Natural Resources truck rolled into view. Uh-oh, James muttered, glancing around at the remnants of their party. We might have been a bit too loud. The truck stopped, and a ranger stepped out, shining a flashlight in their direction. Evening, folks, he said, his tone firm but not unkind. We've had some noise complaints. Everything all right here? Antoine stood up, trying to look as sober as possible. Sorry about that, officer. We lost track of time. We'll quiet down. Under his breath, he added, Sorry, I didn't know fun was illegal. The ranger nodded, his expression softening slightly. Just keep it down, all right? It's late, and there are other campers around. Will do, Jeff said, giving a thumbs up. The ranger gave them one last examining look before getting back in his truck and driving off. As the sound of the engine faded, the group let out a collective sigh of relief and no little amount of irritation. Well, that was close, Joel said, chuckling. Guess that's our cue to head to bed, James said, stretching. They all nodded in agreement, the fatigue of the night finally catching up with them. They made their way to their tents, the campsite now quiet and peaceful. Antoine and Jeff shared one tent, while James and Joel took to their own. As they settled into their sleeping bags, the events of the night still lingered. Hey, Antoine, Jeff whispered, staring at the tent ceiling. "Thanks for coming out here. This was fun, and it would have been less so without you. I mean, you have to admit, this is pretty nice, ain't it?" Antoine smiled, his eyes already closing. "Wouldn't have missed it for the world. I'm glad I'll let you twist my arm. As much as I didn't want to say something, I really needed this. Just the clean air was worth it. Hopefully tomorrow ain't so bad. It's Michigan. What the hell does the weatherman know anyway?" In the other tents, James and Joel were already halfway to dreamland. The echoes of their laughter left parts of their face still sore. "See you in the morning," Joel mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Yeah," James whispered back. "Morning." The forest was silent now, the only sounds the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl. The fire died down to glowing embers. The stars above resumed their steady twinkle, as if winking at the adventures that had taken place below. Antoine lay cocooned in his sleeping bag, the steady rhythm of Jeff's breathing beside him, a reminder of the comforting normalcy of sleep. The forest outside their tent was a symphony of nocturnal sounds, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was some time past midnight when Antoine's gut began to churn, a discomfort that roused him from his slumber and refused to be ignored. He sighed inwardly, realizing that nature was calling in the most inconvenient way possible. He had to shit. Reluctantly, Antoine sat up, trying to move as quietly as possible so as not to disturb Jeff. However, his friend stirred, half awake, and guessed what had woken Antoine. "Take the flashlight," Jeff mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Better than your half-dead-ass phone. I don't want to have to send a search party after you in the morning." Antoine nodded, appreciating the suggestion. He reached for the flashlight hanging from the lantern hook at the ceiling of the tent and retrieved the toilet paper sealed in a waterproof Ziploc bag. Stepping out of the tent, he was immediately enveloped by the inky blackness of the forest. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing spaced trees and fallen pine needles that carpeted the forest floor. He made his way a respectful distance down the path, hoping no one would stumble upon his pile of excrement. Finding a suitable spot, Antoine squatted down to do his business, placing the flashlight in his teeth to keep his hands free. The beam of light panned around the immediate vicinity, casting eerie shadows that flickered with his every movement. The white colour of the light seemed to mute everything. Suddenly, the noise of a woodland creature scurrying off caught his attention, and he jerked slightly, the flashlight wobbling in his mouth. He aimed the light in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing, though the sound had unsettled him. "God damn it!" he said out loud. As he did another scan of his surroundings, it was then that he saw it in a pass of the light, a shape, like the silhouette of a man leaning against a tree. His heart skipped a beat. He quickly panned the flashlight back in that direction, but now there was nothing there. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable, and paranoia did its best to send him fleeing for the tent. Hastily but aware of every noise-mo, he wiped himself and tossed the toilet paper on the ground, swiftly burying it with a scoop of dirt using his boot. With a haste akin to a child afraid of the dark, Antoine made his way back to the tent and slipped inside quickly, his breathing shallow and rapid. Jeff, who had drifted back to sleep, woke up again at the sound of Antoine's hurried movements. "You okay?" Jeff asked, his voice laced with concern. "Yeah," Antoine replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "Just, nature sounds and all. Thought I saw something, but it was probably nothing." Jeff studied him for a moment, eyes unfocused. "Well, if you need to go out again, don't hesitate to wake me. Better to have two sets of eyes out there." Antoine nodded, though he hoped he wouldn't need to venture out again until daylight. He settled back into his sleeping bag, trying to find comfort in its warmth. Even though the promised cold was upon them, enjoyed by a gentle sprinkle of rain, the small droplets struck the tent in a moist staccato. Eventually, fatigue overcame his anxiety, and he drifted back into an uneasy sleep. The dawn broke early, casting rays of brilliant light through the trees and painting the forest floor with a golden hue. The sounds of birds chirping replaced the eerie silence of the night. Antoine awoke to the smell of instant coffee being made, a small comfort in the midst of the wilderness. Jeff had already started a fire and was preparing breakfast. "Morning," Jeff greeted, as Antoine emerged from the tent, stretching and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Morning," Antoine replied, feeling a bit better in the daylight. "Smells good. Figured we could use a good breakfast before we head out for the day," Jeff said, handing Antoine a steaming cup of coffee. "How'd you sleep?" "Not great," Antoine admitted. "That trip to the woods really threw me off. Jeff looked at him seriously. "You sure you're straight? You seemed pretty shook last night. You didn't see Sasquatch out there, did you?" Antoine took a sip of his coffee, savouring the warmth. "No, I think it was just my imagination. The woods can be pretty creepy at night. I definitely heard something, but it couldn't have been much bigger than a raccoon." Jeff nodded, though he seemed unconvinced. "Well, let's just stay vigilant. It's easy to get paranoid out here, but better safe than sorry. There are still bears and wolves out in these parts, probably a few wolverines too. They ate their breakfast in relative silence, each lost in their own tasks." The plan for the day was to hike deeper into the forest, exploring some of the less travelled paths. They packed up their camp, leaving most in their vehilses, making sure to leave no trace behind, and set off with their backpacks, the morning sun filtering through the canopy above. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, with beams of sunlight breaking through the leaves and casting dappled shadows on the ground. Antoine unconsciously scanned for footprints in the area. He estimated that weird shapes stood. He was pleased and relieved to find no evidence of a creeping voyeur. The air was fresh and crisp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. Antoine shook off the lingering unease from the night before, focusing instead on the beauty around him. "Hey, you guys," he called from the back of the convoy. "You guys want some more breakfast?" He dangled a bag of potent weed gummies in the air. A conspiratorial grin plastered across his face. They gathered as he served our 75 milligrams apiece. Plenty enough to bring them to a baseline in tune with the woods around them. As they walked, Jeff kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out the clear and visible deer tracks in the soft earth. He had a knack for making the wilderness feel less intimidating, and Antoine found himself relaxing a bit. They reached a small clearing by a stream and decided to take a break. Sitting on a large rock, Antoine took in the serene surroundings. The sound of the water flowing over the rocks was soothing, and he began to feel more at ease. If they were to listen closely, they could hear the falls nearby. Jeff was busy filling their water bottles from the stream, using a portable filter to ensure it was safe to drink. "You know," Jeff said, breaking the silence, "there's an old legend about these woods." Antoine raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yeah? What kind of legend?" Jeff sat down next to him, a mischievous glint in his eye. "They say that a long time ago a hermit lived out here. He was a recluse, shunned by the nearby townsfolk. Some say he was into weird shit, witchcraft and shit. Others say he was just mad. But the story goes that he cursed these woods, and his spirit still roams here, watching anyone who dares to enter. Sometimes he takes parts of them with him, whether for a souvenir or a snack none could say." Antoine chuckled, though he couldn't deny the slight chill that ran down his spine. "Sounds like a typical campfire story." "Maybe," Jeff said with a shrug. "But who knows? Every legend has a grain of truth, right? And out here, other than the old Native Americans of the past, no one knows what lies just beyond the trees. I mean, look around. Have you seen any evidence of anybody else through here? There probably hasn't been a person through here for months, hell, maybe years. This ain't the average hiking trail. I just so happened to find this the last time I was up here." They continued their hike after a quick rest, the conversation turning to lighter topics. Antoine couldn't help but think about the silhouette he had seen the night before. It was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe a tree that looked like a person in the darkness. But Jeff's story had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, reawakening unspoken fears and images burned into his mind. As the day wore on, they ventured deeper into the forest, the path becoming narrower and less defined. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy overhead. The light grew dimmer, and the air cooler, as if they were entering a different world. They came across an old, overgrown trail that seemed to lead to a long-forgotten part of the forest. Jeff, ever the adventurer, suggested they follow it. Antoine hesitated for a moment, but then agreed. After all, they were here to explore. The trail wound through the forest, leading them to a small, abandoned cabin. It was weathered and covered in moss, but still standing remarkably. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking gently in the breeze. "Looks like we found the hermit's cabin," Jeff said with a grin. Antoine felt a mix of dread and apprehension. "Should we go in?" He joked, but none found it humorous. James took it as an invitation. Jeff nodded, already making his way to the door behind James. "Why not? It's probably just an old hunting cabin." They stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under their weight. The interior was dark and musty, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. There were remnants of old furniture, a table and chair, and a fireplace filled with ashes. It was clear that no one had been here for a long, long time. Jeff began to explore, opening cabinets and drawers, while Antoine stood near the door, his trepidation rooting him in place. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were intruding, that they were not alone. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified, echoing in the silence. "Hey, check this out," Jeff called, holding up an old leather-bound book. "Looks like a journal." Antoine moved closer, peering over Jeff's shoulder as he opened the book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten entries. The writing was difficult to read, but they could make out bits and pieces. "The townsfolk fear me, shunned and alone. He woods are my sanctuary. Strange noises at night, whispers in the darkness. Feel their eyes upon mum. The curse shall protect mum. His spirit will remain." Antoine shivered. "Creepy. Maybe y'all should leave that shit alone. Clearly y'all haven't seen your fair share of horror movies. This is wrong." Jeff, however, was fascinated. "This is amazing. It's like a piece of history. We should take it with us." Antoine hesitated, but then nodded. "All right, but let's get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." They left the cabin, the journal tucked safely in Jeff's backpack. The forest seemed darker now, and the feeling of being watched had returned. They made their way back to the main trail, the silence between them growing heavier with each step. Joel was humming a tune, and James seemed to be lost in deep thought, peering up to the canopy here and there, as if looking for something. As they reached their campsite, there were plenty of day left. Yet the wind and rain conspired against any plan they had of swimming. Renting a canoe was still on the table, but the prospect was overshadowed by the increasing wind and rain. Storm clouds lingered, but sun occasionally broke through, glimpses of vibrant fall foliage emerging as mist burned away. Upon reaching Upper Taquamenan Falls, they joined a growing crowd converging on scenic overlooks. The parking lot was populated by people with umbrellas and ponchos, shielding themselves from the worst of it. Antoine followed closely behind Joel and James through the mist-shrouded path, Jeff trailing alongside. Emerging at the first viewpoint, they shrugged off rain-spattered jackets to take in the thundering cascade. At the top of the paved trail, they found the perfect spot to take a break. Looking around to ensure they had no prying eyes, James lit up a joint. Even though weed was legal in Michigan, it was still frowned upon and even findable to smoke in national parks. So, with their head on a swivel they took in the green ganja, James spoke after a long coughing fit. "Hey, you guys want to go up the trail a bit?" Joel and Jeff nodded. Antoine declined their invitation. He was exhausted and the view was perfectly fine from where he stood, so without him the rest of the group moved on, leaving him to his own thoughts. The mists swirled heavier around Antoine as he gazed out over the falls, the roar of the cascading waters filling his ears. When he turned back from the railing, something caught his eye that had not been there before. An old man sat hunched upon the bench, his lined face downcast. But as Antoine paid the man no mind to return his view to the falls. In the small amount of time that he took in the sights, the old man had vanished entirely, leaving behind only a small pocket watch resting upon the weathered wood. Intrigued, Antoine picked up the watch, turning it over in his hands. The timepiece had long since stopped, its face clouded and still. Within, a faded photo was tucked. A woman in a crimson dress and large white hat smiled out from another era. A loose corner drew Antoine's attention, and he pried it up to find an inscription etched upon the inner back in flowing Latin script. Curious, he read the words aloud only to find their meaning unclear. Pocketing the strange find, Antoine rejoined his companions just as rain began to fall once more. They retreated down the winding trail as dusk gathered, deciding the day was as good as done. "What have you, huh?" Joel said with a sigh. "Never gets old looking out over all that water. I've been coming out here every other year since I was a youngling, man. I love it here." "The simple life, surrounded by all this nature, I would never leave." Antoine nodded. "It was incredible. And so peaceful too, listening to the falls." He pulled out the old pocket watch once more, turning it over ponderously. James glanced over. "What you got there?" Retelling his experience on the overlook, Antoine showed them the watch and faded photo within. "See this writing? I can't make heads or tails of it." Weird. "Probably just some old dude fucking with you," Jeff offered. They emerged from the woods, then into the parking lot, the misting rain more noticeable out in the open. Lights from the visitor center guided their way to the truck. "I'm starved," Joel declared, patting his belly. "Burgers and corn on the cob sounding good for everyone back at camp?" Excited affirmations met his question. "And I've still got that other joint for later. I'm saving it for after dinner by the fire," James added with a grin. The watch heavy in his pocket, Antoine climbed into the back seat, thoughts returning to the old man. Chapter 3. The Call. As darkness fell across the forest, the four friends ate their fill by the crackling fire. With full bellies and chilled bottled waters, they readied themselves for sleep, as the northern sky glittered with more stars than any could remember seeing. Antoine and Jeff retired to their tent, zipping the mesh portal shut against any prowling insects. But sleep did not immediately claim them, and they passed the hours quietly discussing random subjects. From games and movies they've watched together on previous trips to the itinerary for tomorrow. A lull in their chatter allowed the sounds of the surrounding woods to filter in, the flowing river, rustling undergrowth, nocturnal wildlife beginning its nightly business. It was during one such pause that Antoine heard it, a muffled click from the pocket hanging just inside the tent flap. Frowning, he sat up and rifled through the fabric until his fingers closed around cold metal. Pulling out the pocket watch, he was alarmed to see a faint glow emanating from within its scratched casing. "Jeff, look at this!" he hissed in disbelief. His friend struggled upright, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What the hell?" The glow dissipated before Jeff could witness the event, leaving him looking confused and dead tired. His hair was in disarray and sleep leadened his eyelids. Before any other words could pass, Jeff was back horizontal and snoring loudly. A pressing need to relieve himself spurred Antoine from the tent, phone clenched tightly. But as he glanced around, an icy dread crept through him. The forest was too still, too swallowed up in ebony shadow. Eyes shone deep within the tree line, cold and deadly. Antoine sensed more than saw. Darker shapes creeped closer through the gloom. Lizard brain panic seized him. He had to get away, had to warn the others. Stumbling and blind in the darkness, he tore back into the tent, breath soaring in his throat. "Jesus, what happened?" Jeff sat up urgently, taking in Antoine's bone-white face and wide eyes. But no words would come, only a strangled whimper as Antoine scrabbled around for the zipper closure with trembling hands. Finally sealing themselves in from the menace outside, there came another shriek, louder and closer than before. Jeff flinched at the sound, hair standing on end all over his body. "Antoine, talk to me, man, what is it?" Still, Antoine could only stare through the rain fly, paralyzed by nameless fear. Something was out there, and it knew they were there. Antoine tried to calm himself and rationalize, but no explanation soothed his worries or seemed to fit. He stared through the transparent flap vacantly, unable to gather his thoughts. An hour dragged by as they lay there silent and unmoving, straining their ears for any sign of an approach. Only when the first hints of dawn lightened the sky did Antoine begin to calm. Tremors echoed through his frame. But no more sounds disturbed the camp. As consciousness rose in Jeff, he became aware of an empty space beside him where Antoine should be. As Jeff awoke to the empty tent, confusion and panic set in. He unzipped the flap, eyes darting around the barely lit campsite. "Joel, James! Wake up, it's Antoine, he's gone!" Rustling and muffled curses greeted his call as the others emerged, rubbing sleep from their eyes. "What do you mean, gone?" Joel asked. "I don't know, man, I just woke up and he wasn't here." Jeff's voice climbed with anxiety. James scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Maybe he had to take a leak in the night and got turned around? This forest is dense." Joel nodded. "Yeah, probably just got lost." But doubt gnawed at Jeff. "Guys, you didn't see him last night. Something freaked him out bad. I don't think he would have left the tent." A sense of unease passed between them at his words. Without further discussion, they split up to comb the surrounding woods, calling Antoine's name repeatedly. The day dragged on with no sign of their lost friend. Brush and cliffs proved difficult terrain to track. As dusk fell once more with no answer to their shouts, they regrouped tired and worried around the dead campfire. "I swept the south side clear to the ridge," Joel reported grimly. "Not so much as a broken branch out of place." James nodded. "North end was a dead end too. No clue where he could have got to." Anxiety twisted Jeff's gut into knots. "It doesn't make any sense." Antoine wouldn't just vanish into thin air. They fell silent, staring into the flame's depths as though the answers lay within. Finally James spoke. "Look, it's been a full day with no leads. Joel and I have to head out at first light, can't miss work on Monday." Jeff shook his head angrily. "So that's it, you're just giving up? Our friend is missing and you're abandoning the search?" "We spent all day combing these woods, man." James spread his hands helplessly. "Short of calling in the cops, I don't know what else to do." "Then fuck off, both of you," Jeff growled, voice raw. If I have to, I'll stay here a full week before I leave without Antoine. You go ahead and run back to your normal lives." With that, he stood and stalked into the shadows, leaving his two half-hearted companions unsure of how to respond. As darkness cloaked the forest, Jeff stomped angrily through the murky shadows, Antoine's fate twisting his gut into knots. How could they just abandon their search? Jeff knew in his bones that something sinister was at play here. He kicked at fallen branches, playing the events of the previous night over and over in his mind. Antoine's panicked eyes, the unearthly howls piercing the dense pines, it didn't add up. Jeff was determined to get to the bottom of it, even if he had to brave these woods alone. Meanwhile, Joel and James stuffed their gear into James's beat-up car, hardly exchanging a word as they pulled away from the desolate campsite, leaving Jeff to his vigil. They drove in moody silence through the thinning trees. Just past Paradise, a side road beckoned them towards what little daylight remained. "Maybe we'll get lucky and find a clue out this way," Joel offered hopefully. The long dirt track wound deep into the brooding forest, but 20 minutes in, James spotted a large root snaking across the road, too late to avoid its grasp. There was a savage crunch as the car bucked upward, axle shattering on impact. Stranded, the friends surveyed the damage by flashlight. Damn it! James kicked the tire in frustration. They attempted to call for help, but cell service cut off miles ago. With darkness closing in quickly, an uneasy chill settled over them in the narrow confinement of the woods. As evening drew her shroud across the forest, Jeff paced their abandoned campsite like a caged panther. He refused to give up on Antoine, though searching these tangled woods alone in the dark seemed a hopeless task. Something still drew him back here tonight, an unexplainable hunch that answers lay somewhere within these looming pines. Jeff stalked doggedly through the purpling gloom, every muscle coiled tight as a tripwire. He swept the narrow beam of his flashlight in a steady northward track, eyes peeled for any sign of disturbance in the thick fallen leaves. After half an hour, a flash of white at the tree line caught his eye. Heart lurching into his throat, Jeff hurried over to investigate. Lying half-buried under detritus was a familiar worn sneaker, paint splattered across one toe, unmistakably Antoine's favourite Walmart kicks. Closer inspection revealed snapped branches and scuffed earth leading deeper into shadow. Jeff shouldered on, letting the dim path guide his purposeful strides. But all too soon it ended abruptly at the shoreline of a vast black lake, its churning waters disappearing into the depths of night. A shiver raced up Jeff's spine as he pictured Antoine somehow lost to those treacherous depths. No, he refused to believe his friend would be so careless. Shaking off the grim image, Jeff checked his phone. 2 missed calls and a voicemail from the marooned Joel and James awaited him, pleading for rescue. Their description of the decrepit dirt road tracked with the one Jeff saw near the gift shop in town. With a growl of frustration, Jeff pocketed the phone once more. "This whole damn trip is cursed, I swear." His boots kicked at the pebbled shore, anger and worry twisting inside him. The gathering gloom seemed to echo his unease as the forest swallowed the last rays of daylight. Shadows crowded thick as the forest drank down the last dregs of daylight. Jeff hurried his steps, phone lighting the winding path back to camp with a feeble glow. Darkness encircled as he emerged into the lonely clearing. His car was cold comfort against the gathering gloom under the pines. Sparing one last long look at the impervious woods, Jeff sighed and started the engine. Twin beams stabbed through the murk, reflecting off an orange vest. A DNR truck idled at the road, its driver stepping out to peer nearsightedly into the glare. Jeff hesitated, then rolled down the window to let the muted orange glow spill within. "Evening, officer. I've got a missing person out here. A friend disappeared last night. My friends and I have been searching all day with no luck." The ranger listened with a grave expression. "I'll radio it in. Better head to the police station off 28, give a statement. They'll get a search party organized at first light." With a weary nod of thanks, Jeff pulled away, watching in the rear view as the ranger climbed back into his truck. Jeff drove wearily down the long dirt road leading away from the abandoned campsite. Though angry with Joel and James for giving up the search, some small part of him hoped they might yet help in their efforts to find Antoine. As he neared the highway back to civilization, a lesser track caught his eye stretching into the dense woods. Remembering James's message about breaking down near an old lighthouse, Jeff sighed and signaled to take the detour. It was a slow 20 minutes along the rough trail before he spotted the stranded truck's running lights filtering between the towering pines. But as he rolled to a stop, Dread clutched at his heart. The driver door hung ajar, casting an eerie glow into the murk, and within that luminous frame, dark smears stained the metal in a gruesome tableau. No. Jeff staggered from his car, already knowing what horrors he might find, yet dreading to witness them with his own eyes. "Joel! James!" His shouts reverberated into the dense forest unanswered. Steeling himself, Jeff edged towards the truck and what secrets it withheld. At the rear, a ragged gasp turned his blood to ice. Through the trees, a lone figure stood trembling, limp hands dangling loose at his sides while his gaze stretched wide and unseeing into the void beneath the boughs. "Joel?" Jeff's hoarse whisper seemed to stir the man at last, drawing his dull eyes round with awful slowness. Recognition flickered faintly as their eyes met, but was quashed under waves of shock and grief. He took an unsteady step, arms rising as if to grasp help that wasn't there. Jeff lurched forward just in time to catch the larger man as his knees buckled, soft whimpers issuing from his blood-spattered lips. "It's okay, I've got you," Jeff soothed, though inside he raged and shuddered. Gently scooping Joel's arm over his shoulder, he bore his friend back to the safety of his vehicle. Once inside the back seat with the door shut firmly, Jeff leaned in anxiously. "Joel, please, talk to me." He braced for nightmares. "What did this to you? Where is James?" It was the mere mention of the name that triggered something in Joel. He broke into uncontrollable sobs, covering his face with crimson hands. After minutes that felt like small eternities, he looked up with reddened eyes. It took him, man." Jeff's heart sank. "What took him? What are you talking about?" Jeff replied sternly. "I don't know," Joel shouted. "We were," he stammered, tears filling his eyes. "We were standing over by the lighthouse. We made the call. On the way back, we heard something big in the woods. It took him screaming." Jeff looked at his tattered state. What took him where? And what's with all the blood?" As if he hadn't noticed before, Joel looked down in horror at the dried stains on his hands and clothes. It was then the screams began, both from Joel and somewhere deep into the shadows down the dirt path. A familiar scream, deep and bellowing, as if a demon had been impaled on a branch deep in the foreboding shade ahead. Jeff was at a weird crossroads between fight or flight. Surely that was Antoine, he recognizes that voice clearly. But this wasn't Mudvayne karaoke. This was agony, pain, despair. For a brief moment he considered throwing his car in reverse and gunning it, but he just couldn't leave Antoine hurt in the woods. He gripped the steering wheel with a knuckle-popping grip and decided. He was investigating the scream Joel's died when he realized that wasn't an echo of his own. He was like a deer in the headlights, eyes wide with terror, frozen in place. Don't do it! Are you fucking crazy? The thing's gonna get you? Gonna get both of us? Don't open the fucking door!" Jeff spun on Joel. "Listen," in the firmest tone he could muster in his current state. "You can sit here in this car. You can even follow the trail out to the main road. But I'm not going to leave him out there. What if he's broken a leg or something? How do you know this thing?" He meticulously pronounced the word. "Got to, Antoine. All I know is my friend's out there." He snatched the keys from the ignition and slammed the door in his wake. Joel sat in the silent car, shrinking into the shadows of the back seat, watching as Jeff's phone light faded into obscurity amongst the shaded pines. Jeff took a few steps down the trail. Seconds upon walking from the perceived safety of the car, he felt it. A deep hollowness in his belly and taint of his thoughts. That turned every air-kissed leaf into the footstep of a predator, and every wind-blown branch a dangling limb, meant to puncture and rend unwelcome flesh amongst its roots. The shadows deepened to an unimaginable black, the color of starless space, a void of unforgiving nothingness. He shunned these thoughts, pushing down the unbelievable need to scream. "What the fuck am I doing?" he thought to himself. Yet unwaveringly he continued towards the direction he placed the last scream, which seemed like several minutes ago. Time seemed to be affected differently in this place. It was to Jeff, as if the world had gone on without him, separate from the reality he found himself in. He waited for another scream, but all he heard was dirt crunching under his footsteps, and the occasional gust of wind that rattled the trees like muted maracas above. The warmth that should accompany any Michigan summer night was absent. He felt a chill that made him want to tuck his arms in his t-shirt. Eventually he did hear a noise, like a toddler digging its hands into macaroni and cheese. Other, harder to describe sounds joined the cacophony, like someone was pulling strips from denim, and other slurping-like sounds. Jeff almost screamed when the blurry shapes, hardly discernible in the darkness ahead, began to take shape. Unrecognizable, soon became horrifyingly clear something was eating Antoine. A misshapen, malformed creature, skin as pale as milk, barbed protrusions jutting out from various points where way too many joints met. Arms like bent spider legs reached elongated fingers into the nearly hollow body cavity of Antoine, whose eyes were glazed and unfocused, staring into nothing. His mutilated body ended at a trail of discarded flesh and freshly spilled blood. A clear path had been carved out by Antoine's body as he was dragged to this malignant banquet. Jeff was paralyzed, locked into place by unbound terror. He willed himself to turn around, to flee screaming. But his body was unresponsive. Instead, he did all he could do. Watch in terror, and hope the creature didn't notice his approach, or the fact he took one baby step at a time backwards. Once he was, from his point of view, far enough to do so, he turned and bolted, cell phone rising and falling in his hand, briefly illuminating the narrow path ahead. He had never run so hard, so fast at any other time in his life. But the creature did notice and was gaining ground fast. He could hear the earth reverberating thuds of the creature's footfalls getting louder and close by each heartbeat. Jeff felt as if, at any second, the thing would slash his back open or pull his head from his still-running body. But he pushed harder until he saw the car in the strobing of his waving phone. He was in the car with keys in the ignition faster than Joel had time to react to his return. It was only when he corrected himself from the violent reverse the car had taken, when gravity pulled him back into the seat as Jeff gunned it. "What? Did you see it? Did you find Antoine?" "Yeah, I found Antoine. He's fucked. We're fucked. Now shut up and check behind us. Do you see it?" "Mon Joel, talk to me. Tell what the fuck you see," Jeff demanded. Nothing but trees and shadows, man." "What the fuck? What is this thing?" "I don't know," Jeff said grimly, checking his rear view. In that one small miscalculation, he missed the deer stepping in front of his car. The sound of impacted metal and shattering glass was all Jeff heard before succumbing to unconsciousness upon collision with an elder pine. When he slowly came back, his vision was doubled. It seemed as if someone placed a red filter on his field of view. Everything was tinted light crimson and he could taste blood, probably from the tooth knocked loose against the steering wheel. The first thing his focusing eyes could make out was the clearly dead Joel, his upper half unnaturally compressed against the unyielding bark of the tree, porcupined in broken glass. He spilled out of the car like dumped entrails. He felt like he was broken everywhere, and an incessant sign note rang his ears. With wobbling arms, he pushed himself up to a seated position. Fortunately, the creature hadn't caught up, but the approaching footsteps increasingly reminded him of his dire predicament. Unable to do much else, he pulled himself from the side of the car, past the beaming lights, and into the thicket of tall grass and fallen branches on the side of the road. The monstrous shape stepped into what little light refracted off of the broken glass on the ground and veiled moonlight spilling from the thickening grey clouds above. Jeff slowed his breathing and remained as still and silent as he could as the beast came to a slow meander. It lowered itself from almost the canopy to a spider-like crouch on all fours, smelling the air. The metallic scent of blood seemed to excite the strange being, sending ripples of ecstasy or pleasure up its inhuman form. It crept up to the open driver door with an animal-like curiosity. It lowered its head to look in the car. Seeing Joel's mingled corpse, it reached in and drug his still-warm body into the night air, wasting no time at Sun gets inch-long dagger-like teeth into Joel's chest meat, pulling off strips of flesh, mouthful by mouthful. The disgusting noises of the creature's feast turned Jeff's stomach. He pressed a hand against his mouth and remained as still as a statue. Across the dirt road, something snapped a branch deeper into the woods. Without hesitation, the creature lunged into the shadows after the sound, leaving the body with a pool of blood forming around it in the middle of the road. It was then, when the creature was distracted, that Jeff made his move. As quickly as his feet could carry him, he ran towards the water, hoping with all he had left in him that the creature would not pursue him into the rough waters. It was a stupid, almost suicidal decision, but in just mine, it was better than being torn apart by some unknown entity in the middle of the woods. Within a few minutes, guided only by the moonlight, he saw a sign that had the name given to the farm it belonged to etched on it. He remembered passing it and knew that the main road was just ahead. To his relief, he heard car engines and could almost make out headlights passing vehicles through the dense pines. Nearly being hit by several cars, he stopped in the middle of traffic and turned around. If the creature did pursue him, he couldn't see it. Another vehicle pressed on its brakes and came to a stop just beside Jeff. "Are you okay?" the man in the silver Jeep asked, concern evident to his face. Getting no response, the man got out of his car and approached him to coax Jeffrey to the side of the road. Jeff broke his gaze away from the dark woods and made eye contact with the stranger. "I need a ride now, please. Something in the woods just killed my friend." "Friends!" The last word came out choked. The man opened his back door and told Jeff to get in. Only once the car was in motion did Jeff find his voice. "I don't know what the fuck it was, some skinny, pale thing. I found it eating one of my friends, Joel, he." Jeff couldn't get the rest of the words out. It was no creature that killed Joel, it was his own curiosity. Taking his eyes off the road cost the man's life, but self-loathing was for later. For now his only focus was escape and to find help. What a joke, he thought of to himself. Who the fuck could possibly help me? These words he said out loud. The man who introduced himself as Bernard looked at him with a strange expression. They were at the police station in no time. An unimpressive place surrounded by no adjacent buildings. A single patrol car was parked in front of it. A string of unmarked cars filled the other two spaces. Thanklessly, Jeff left the confines of the car and briskly walked towards the door. The man lingered for a minute, most likely to see that Jeff made his way inside and pulled away, surely with the story to return home with, and a curiosity that might lead him to his own demise one day. Chapter 4. Questions. Sergeant Marks leaned back in his creaking chair, eyeing the distraught young man before him with well-practiced scrutiny. "Let me see if I've got this straight, son. You and your friends went camping in the woods. One disappears in the night, so you search but find no trace. Then two more break down and call for help. Only when you arrive, one is missing and presumed dead by the other." Jeff nodded weakly from his seat, wrapped tight in a department-issue wool blanket. The events of the past 24 hours had drained him to his core. Marks made a show of consulting his notes. "Antoine Valdez went missing first. You claim to have found his shoe near Superior's Shore, but no other signs. Joel Russ and James Hancock broke down near an old lighthouse. But when you got there, Hancock was gone, according to Russ." "Yes, sir. That's exactly what happened." Jeff maintained weary eye contact, hoping his sincerity showed true. The sergeant's expression gave nothing away. "I'd be remiss not to note, son, that we've had a few peculiar incidents out that way before, folks vanishing into those woods never to be seen again. The ones who return babble stories just as fanciful as yours." Jeff stiffened, senses on high alert. What wasn't this gruff officer saying? But Marks merely pushed back from the desk with a grunt. "Well, I can't rightly charge you with anything yet. We'll put DNR and our other officers on the case while we sort this mess out. As for you, the Red Arrow's got rooms. Get some shut-eye. You're going to need it." Sergeant Marks dropped Jeff off with his meagre duffel at the Red Arrow Motel just outside of town. The sparse room would suffice for the night, though rest seemed a distant hope with the horrors replaying endlessly in his mind. A tempting distraction, Jeff turned on the small TV, hoping home improvement shows might ease his fraught nerves. But as midnight came and went with only fitful dozes between scanning the encroaching forest, even chipper instructions couldn't quiet the memories of bloody hands and empty stares. By 3 a.m., Jeff teetered on the brink of exhaustion, weighing each gruesome possibility with mounting dread. Had more fallen prey to the same gruesome fate as his friends? Why did the forest call so many to their doom? And what ungodly force still lurked within those murky pines, waiting for its next victims? Whatever spectre haunted the night would have to wait. Jeff could resist sleep no longer. Bolting the flimsy door, he collapsed back onto the lumpy mattress, shuttering his raw mind to the nightmares certain to come. Morning light pried Jeff from a thankfully dreamless sleep, grit coating his parched senses. Stumbling to the window, he rolled a joint and breathed deep, hoping its herbal kiss might soothe frayed nerves. The door's rusty hinges creaked as he stepped out into the breeze. The brisk northern air reset his wandering mind as Jeff studied the pines encircling the motel. How could such horrors lurk within such peaceful groves? He shook his head, unwilling to surrender the beauty of this place to fear. A door creaked open next door, drawing his gaze. A slender woman stepped out for a smoke, glancing curiously at Jeff's lit joint. Their eyes met briefly, and she gestured at her cigarette with a smile. "Got a light?" Wordlessly, Jeff offered an open flame from his bic, watching her lean in with a graceful curtsy. She settled on the railing as they smoked in silence. At last she spoke, exhaling a cloud of vapour. "Rough night?" Sympathy edged her soft inquiry. Jeff struggled for words, but she nodded in acceptance. "Not your fault. You don't know me, I'm a stranger, that's fair." A wry twist of lips beneath watchful eyes. Jeff felt slightly embarrassed for his loss for words, so instead he took another drag from the joint. Her cigarette finished, she dropped it amongst the fallen leaves and headed inside with a farewell. Jeff lingered, considering her calming presence, before walking Paradise's quiet streets, seeking something to dull yesterday from his mind. Officer Marks stepped from his cruiser, his boots crunching on the gravel, the chill of the Upper Peninsula biting through his uniform. The scene was as Geoffrey had described, a mangled vehicle, shards of glass glinting in the morning light, motor oil pooling in dark puddles, and the unmistakable scent of blood hanging in the air. Marks felt a shiver run through him, not from the cold but from something else, a sense of foreboding that had become all too familiar since moving here. He recalled the tales he'd heard, whispered in hushed tones at the local bar, and passed down from the Ojibwa tribe. Stories of creatures lurking in the dense woods, shadows that shifted and danced just beyond the edge of sight. As a man of facts, Marks had always brushed them off as folklore, but now, standing amidst the wreckage, he couldn't help but wonder. The vehicle was a twisted mass of metal, the windshield shattered, its interior stained with blood. As he surveyed the scene, his eyes were drawn to the ground, large, elongated handprints pressed deep into the dirt. They were too many, too irregular to belong to any one creature Marks knew of. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the evidence before him with the rational explanations he clung to. Further down the dirt road, he spotted another vehicle, James Hancock's. It was abandoned, the door flung open as if its occupant had left in a hurry. Marks followed a trail of blood leading from the crashed car into the woods, his breath visible in the cold air as he moved deeper into the shadows. Along the trail, he found Joel Russ's ID, a dark reminder of the human lives tangled in this mystery. Nearby, something glinted in the underbrush, a golden pocket watch. As he reached for it, a strange numbness crept into his fingertips, stopping him short. Instinctively he withdrew his hand, feeling a cold sweat break out across his brow. Returning to his car, Marks retrieved his evidence kit. With gloved hands, he used medical tongs to pick up the pocket watch, depositing it into an evidence bag. He did the same with Joel's ID, his mind turning over the possibilities. Could Geoffrey, a man barely 120 pounds, have orchestrated this? The fear in Geoffrey's eyes had seemed genuine, his description of what he'd seen, something otherworldly, impossible to dismiss outright. Standing alone in the quiet woods, Marks tried to piece together the fragments of the scene. The handprints, the blood, the inexplicable numbness, the facts refused to align neatly. He felt the weight of the mystery pressing in, a knot of tension coiling in his chest. "Fuck, this is a shit show," he muttered to the empty woods, his voice barely more than a whisper. There was much to consider, and the day was only just beginning. Jeff trudged down the empty main street of Paradise, the quaint town nestled between lake and wilderness. Local repair shops were busy, but other than that, it was only the food truck selling fresh white fish solely operating with any visible success. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, amplifying the heaviness in his heart and the weariness in his bones. Jeff shuddered, desperate to purge those horrific images from his mind. He had to get away, had to find some semblance of peace and normalcy, even if just for a little while. As he approached the local gift shop, a flash of movement in the window caught his eye. There, behind the display of dream catchers and beaded jewelry, stood Sue, the Native American woman who owned the store. Their gazes locked, and Jeff was struck by the compassion and understanding reflected in her warm, dark eyes. It was as if she could see right through his carefully constructed facade, straight into the depths of his anguished soul. Drawn by an inexplicable force, Jeff pushed open the door and stepped inside, the jingle of the bell announcing his arrival. Sue went to stand behind the counter, a gentle smile gracing her weathered features. "Welcome to Paradise Gifts," she said softly, her voice tinged with a hint of melancholy. "I'm Sue. Is there anything in particular I can help you find today?" Jeff shook his head, his gaze drifting aimlessly across the shelves of Native American art, hunting gear, and souvenir trinkets. "No, I'm just browsing," he murmured, his words laced with a palpable weariness. Sue nodded, her keen eyes studying him with a discerning gaze. "Well, you just let me know if there's anything I can do for you," she said, her tone warm and inviting. "I'm happy to lend an ear if you need someone to talk to." Jeff simply nodded, his attention now drawn to a W-weathered leather-bound book nestled among the shelves. The faded gold lettering on the cover read Fairy Tales and Lore, with true stories and real eyewitness accounts. Intrigued, he reached out and gently traced the embossed title, his fingers lingering on the worn edges of the pages. Something about this book called to him. Highly doubtful it would provide many answers, he took it out of curiosity. Casting a furtive glance at Sue, he carefully extracted the volume from the shelf and made his way to the counter. "This one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like to purchase this book." Sue's eyes widened ever so slightly as she accepted the book, her fingers caressing the worn leather with a reverence that belied its humble appearance. "Ah, yes," she murmured, her gaze meeting Jeff's with a knowing intensity. "This is a special one indeed." As she rang up the sale, Jeff couldn't help but notice the way her movement slowed, her brow furrowing in contemplation. When the transaction was complete, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the open sign on the door. Casting a furtive glance over her shoulder, she turned to face Jeff, her expression serious. "You know, I have a feeling you're not just here for the sights and sounds of paradise," she said, her voice low and measured. "There's something weighing on your mind, isn't there?" Jeff felt his heart skip a beat, his grip tightening on the book as he nodded mutely. How could she possibly know? Had his grief and trauma etched themselves so deeply into his features that even a stranger could read them like an open book? Sue's gaze softened, and she reached out to gently touch his arm. "Come with me," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "I think there's something you need to see." Without another word, she flipped the open sign to closed and ushered Jeff through a door behind the counter, leading him into a dimly lit back room. The air was heavy with the scent of burning sage and the faint hum of chanting coming from an old record player. Jeff followed Sue into the dimly lit back room, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was thick with the heady scent of burning sage, and an eerie hum of chanting filled the space, sending a shiver down his spine. Sue gestured to a small table in the center of the room, its surface cluttered with an assortment of ancient-looking artifacts and trinkets. Reluctantly, Jeff took a seat across from her, his grip tightening on the leather-bound book he had just purchased. The older woman fixed him with a penetrating gaze, her dark eyes seeming to bore into his very soul. "What did you see, child?" she asked, her voice soft but laden, with a weight that belied her gentle tone. Jeff hesitated, his mouth suddenly dry. He didn't want to relive those horrific memories, to give voice to the unspeakable terror he had witnessed. But there was something in Sue's demeanor, a deep well of understanding and empathy, that compelled him to open up. I saw a creature," he began, his words barely above a whisper. "It was. God, it was so wrong. Pale and grotesque, with too many limbs, too many eyes, and the sounds it made." He shuddered, the memory of that unearthly keening still echoing in his mind. Sue nodded solemnly, her expression grave. "And did you see it taking communion?" she asked, her brow furrowed in a look of deep contemplation. Jeff cocked his head, confusion etching his features. "Communion? I don't you understand." "Forgive me," Sue said, her voice tinged with regret. "Let me rephrase. Did you see the creature?" The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous, and Jeff felt his stomach lurch. Slowly, he nodded, the image of that twisted, bone-white form tearing into the flesh of his friend, searing itself into his mind. Sue's expression darkened, and she shook her head gravely. "Then it has begun," she murmured, her gaze dropping to the table. "What has begun?" Jeff asked, his voice a mixture of fear and desperation. "What is this? This thing?" Sue gestured for Jeff to lay the book on the table, her hand grasping the book. Flipping it open, she turned to a page that depicted a grotesque humanoid figure with sunken eyes and a gaping maw filled with razor-sharp teeth. Below it, a body torn to shreds with parts and chunks of flesh missing. It seemed to be a photograph of an old wood carving of some sort, clearly dating back to before the discovery of parchment or animal hide canvas. "This," she said, her finger tracing the illustration, "is a Wendigo, a creature of our people's darkest legends, a being of insatiable hunger and unimaginable cruelty." Jeff's eyes widened as he studied the horrific image, his heart pounding in his chest. "A Wendigo?" he breathed, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "But how is that possible? I thought those were just stories, folklore." Sue shook her head, her expression grave. "Oh, they are very real, child," she said, her voice tinged with a note of sorrow. And this one. This one has been present in these lands for generations. It feeds and it grows stronger with each passing year. Jeff felt a chill run down his spine as Sue's words sank in. "But why?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why is it here? Why is it doing this?" "It is connected to this land, to the people who call it home," Sue explained, her gaze meeting Jeff's with a weighted intensity. "Through an object or a bloodline, it has rooted itself here, and it will not rest until it has consumed all that it desires." She reached across the table, her weathered hand grasping Jeff's with a surprising strength. "You must leave, child," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "While you still can, this creature, it will not stop until it has feasted on every last soul in these woods." Jeff shook his head, his expression resolute. "I can't," he said, his voice laced with a determination that surprised even him. "Officer Marks, he wants me to stay. To help with the investigation." Sue's eyes widened and she squeezed his hand tightly. "Then you must listen to me, child," she said, her voice low and intense. "This creature, it feeds on the fear and despair of its victims. The more you try to fight it, the stronger it will become." She reached into the folds of her shawl and produced a small, intricately carved talisman, pressing it into Jeff's palm. "Take this," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It will not stop the Wendigo, but it may offer you some protection, some respite from its hunger." Jeff stared at the talisman, its surface etched with strange symbols and runes. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A gift from my people. It may not protect you much, but it will make the monster overlook you. With any luck, it will at least give you an opportunity to escape this place. This isn't the first time this entity has fed on these lands. We have ways to defend ourselves, those who believe. I just hope it starves and returns to where it crawled from. But I've never seen it leave without its due," Sue replied, her expression solemn. "I offer a prayer for safety and a plea for the spirits to watch over you in these dark times." With a heavy heart, Jeff pocketed the talisman, his fingers closing around it like growing roots. "Thank you, I guess," he murmured, his gaze meeting Sue's with a mixture of gratitude and puzzlement. Sue nodded, her eyes deep wells of sorrow. "Go now, child," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And may the Great Spirit watch over you." Jeff stepped out of the dimly lit back room of Paradise Gifts, the leather-bound book and the small, intricately carved talisman weighing heavily in his hands. His mind was reeling from the revelations that Sue had shared, the terrifying truth about the Wendigo, the ancient evil that had taken root in these woods. As he emerged into the sunlight, a familiar sight caught his eye. Officer Marks's police cruiser was pulling into the parking lot, its tires screeching to a halt. The officer's expression was grave, his brow furrowed with a sense of urgency. "Jeff!" Marks called out, his voice stern but polite. "I've been looking all over for you. I need you to come with me. There's something you need to see." Jeff knew something was amiss, his grip tightening on the book and the talisman. Had swallowing the lump in his throat, he nodded and made his way to the cruiser, sliding into the back seat. The ride was tense and silent, the weight of unspoken questions hanging thick in the air. Jeff could feel Marks's gaze flickering to him in the rearview mirror, his jaw set in a determined line. Whatever he had discovered, it was clearly weighing heavily on the officer's mind. Finally, Marks pulled the cruiser into the parking lot of a bar on the outskirts of town. Little more than a cabin in the parking lot seemed robust and full. Jeff furrowed his brow, confused by the unexpected destination. "Sir?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "I thought we were going to the police station." The inside was bustling with activity as Jeff and Officer Marks stepped inside, the scent of stale beer and cigarette smoke hanging thick in the air. The patrons, a melting pot of locals and weary-eyed hunters, turned to regard the newcomers with thinly veiled suspicion. Marks led the way to the bar, his expression grim. "2 whiskeys?" he said to the bartender, his voice low and gruff. "Make 'em strong." The bartender nodded, quickly pouring the drinks and sliding them across the scarred wooden surface. Marks handed one to Jeff, his gaze meeting the man's with a weighted intensity. "I know you've been through a lot, Jeff," he said, his voice carrying a hint of empathy. "And I'm sorry for dragging you into all of this again. But I need you to be straight with me. What did you learn from Sue at the gift shop?" Jeff hesitated, his fingers tightening around the glass. She told me about the Wendigo," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "about how it's been preying on the people of this town for generations." Marks nodded, his expression darkening. "I figured as much," he murmured, taking a long sip from his glass. "And I'm guessing she gave you that little trinket to help protect you, too. Jeff's hand instinctively went to the pocket where the talisman rested, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings. She did, he admitted, his eyes meeting Mark's with uncertainty. She said it wouldn't stop the Wendigo, but it might offer me some protection. Marks let out a weary sigh, his eyes drifting to the glass in his hand. I'm not going to lie to you, Jeff, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. I've seen some pretty messed up things in my time, but this is something else entirely. He paused, his brow furrowing in thought. I don't think you had anything to do with what happened to your friends, he said, his tone softening. I saw something like this a few years ago, and all the signs are the same. Best part of the reason I believe you, hell, you were just as much a victim as they were, at least until the facts tell me otherwise, but I saw the scene. Those footprints don't belong to no mortal beast I know of. I need to know what you know, so we can figure out a way to stop this. Jeff felt a surge of relief wash over him, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. I don't know much more than what Sue told me, he admitted, his gaze dropping to the leather-bound book that still rested in his lap. But I do have this. It may help. He placed the book on the bar, flipping it open to the page that depicted the grotesque humanoid figure of the Wendigo. Marks leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he studied the illustration. So this is what you say we're up against, he murmured, his voice not reflecting the doubt clawing at his mind. But what other explanation could suffice? Jeff nodded, his grip tightening on the glass in his hand. Sue said it's been here for generations, that it's connected to the land and the people in some way. And that it feeds on fear and despair as well as flesh. For a moment when I stood in front of it, I felt like something was draining away from me. Joy, happiness, hopes and dreams, it all seemed distant, like vague emotions, half-formed concepts. Marks let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Figures, he muttered, taking another sip of his drink. So, how the hell are we supposed to stop something like that? Jeff shrugged, his own expression mirroring the officer's sense of helplessness. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But I do know that I can't just sit back and let it continue. Not after what happened to my friends. This thing could spread, I remember Sue saying something like that. Marks nodded, his gaze meeting Jeff's with a newfound respect. I hear you, kid, he said, his voice gruff. And I'm with you, we're going to figure this out. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their task hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Marks drained the last of his drink, his brow furrowing in thought. I think we're going to need a few more of these before we can start making any plans, he said, gesturing to the empty glasses. This is the kind of thing that calls for a little liquid courage, if you ask me. Jeff couldn't help but chuckle, the tension in his muscles slowly easing as the warmth of the whiskey spread through his body. I'm with you on that one, officer, he said, raising his glass in a silent toast. When the time came to leave, Marks once again took charge, guiding the slightly inebriated Jeff out of the bar and towards the motel down the street. I'm getting myself a room for the night, and I'll pay the tab for another on yours, he said, his voice low but firm. We're going to need a clear head to tackle this thing, and I don't think either of us is in any shape to be driving right now. Jeff nodded gratefully, his fingers tightening around the talisman in his pocket. As they walked, he couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. The Wendigo was out there, waiting. Chapter 5, Answers. The rising sun pried Jeff reluctantly from a fitful slumber. Spying the patrol car parked outside, he sparked a joint and retreated to the parking lot, unwilling to disrespect Sergeant Marks's profession. To his surprise, the door slid open as the initial smoke wisped skyward. Marks eyed the joint calmly. Don't bother stomping it. My missus has cancer. I partake now and then when she lights up. Hell with what we have to do today, I'll hit that. Jeff passed it over wordlessly, watching brooding pines lighten against the pale blue vault overhead. They smoked in thoughtful silence, till it was nearly a roach, and Marks stubbed it out. A call to the station informed his deputy he'd need the day for himself. Personal matters to see to, was all explanation given before slipping into the driver's seat. Jeff joined him, sensing this seasoned officer kept deeper counsel. They rode in stillness save for the low hum of tyres on asphalt, each absorbed in their own turnings over. Sparse homes and trailers emerged through thick brush as they rolled onto reservation lands an hour later. Marks cut the motor. The people here may hold answers if you're willing to walk the old paths with an open mind. Jeff followed his lead past weathered dwellings, catching fragments of Ojibwa conversation on the smoky breeze. Somewhere in this community lay knowledge that could lift the shadows from those forested lanes if only he proved ready to receive it. They made their way down the winding path, birdsong filtering through pine boughs overhead. Breaking into a small clearing, Marks nodded to a solitary trailer set apart from the others. 10 minutes later found them on the stoop, receiving 3 stiff knocks. The door opened to reveal an elder, wise eyes regarding them solemnly. His withering glance lingered heavily on Jeff before ushering them inside. Steaming mugs of coffee appeared, and they settled around a worn table as the elder introduced himself as Alvin. At Marks's request, Jeff recounted the horrors in hushed tones, skin prickling under the old man's scrutiny. Alvin considered in thoughtful silence before speaking. Once the Wendigo catches your scent, you are marked. Its hunger will drive it to hunt you relentlessly. Jeff withdrew the talisman gifted by the strange woman, but Alvin shook his head. A small shield, but against such a brutal creature it offers little. Many have tried to slay the Wendigo over generations, yet still it returns to feed. Marks leaned forward. Is there no way to stop it? Alvin took a slow sip. Flowing water seems to deter it, though not completely. Our people have witnessed this many times. Else it would depopulate the forests within months. With all due respect, Marks began carefully, such creatures exist only in stories as I see it. Alvin's steady gaze held his. And I understand the difficulty in believing what defies modern teachings. But your eyes have not seen the monstrous hunger that drives this Wendigo to relentless pursuit, taking any life to sate its unending craving. Jeff shuddered, recalling that dreadful chill. Marks's frown deepened, but he did not dismiss the elder's words. Tell me, Jeff urged Alvin. It can't be water. This ain't a vampire. Sir, you must know of another way, please. The man's soft smile held ages of knowledge. Many moons passed. Some of our bravest hunters were chased by the Wendigo through the forest. It gained swiftly on their heels until they reached the shore, piling into their birch canoe with the beast snapping at their backs. But once in the boat it stopped its pursuit and vanished among the trees, as if an invisible barrier prevented its following over water. But this is a guess. We don't truly know why it stopped. It is an earth spirit, and in ancient teachings they say only fire spirits may aid in its warding and destruction. Rituals long forgotten held some similar sway over the creature, that and salt. It will not cross a salt barrier. I've seen this with my own eyes. At a nudge from Marks, Jeff thanked Alvin, and they took their leave into gathering gloom. The lake-chilled air of the salt stir. Marie tribal lands hung thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Shadows stretched long as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Jeff sat in the back seat of Officer Marks's cruiser, the weight of the day's discoveries pressing down on him like a heavy blanket upon his thoughts, a million of which swirled in his mind, but one question stood out among the chaos. Do you think it's weird, Jeff began, his voice breaking the silence, that the old man mentioned the creature wouldn't cross water? Marks, eyes focused on the road ahead, glanced at Jeff in the rearview mirror. It was a fleeting moment, but it carried with it the weight of understanding, of shared concern. Why do you think that? He asked, his tone casual, but there was a curiosity behind it that made Jeff's heart race. Well, Jeff hesitated, his fingers tapping restlessly against his knees. Since I got the book, I've read everything I could find about Wendigos. I've scoured the internet too. I've never seen any reference to water being a deterrent for these things. He took a breath, gathering his thoughts like a fisherman gathering nets. It's always been salt and fire that bind them. That's what the law says. Marks nodded, considering the implications. The world they had stumbled into was a murky one, filled with half-truths and whispers cloaked in legends. You're right about that, he conceded. But I've got a hunch that old man knows more than he's letting on. Folks around here, they keep their secrets close. It's probably for reasons that go beyond just fear. Jeff felt a flicker of hope ignite in his chest, but it was quickly extinguished by the reality of their situation. They were chasing shadows, and every step forward felt like dancing on the edge of a butcher's blade. What do we do now? He asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Marks turned the cruiser onto a quieter street, his expression shifting from contemplation to resolve. I have an idea, he said. A place where we can test our theories. Water, salt and fire, all in one location. Jeff's curiosity piqued. Where? You'll see, Marks replied cryptically, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. They drove back to the police station in silence. the weight of the unknown hanging between them like a thick fog. As they pulled into the parking lot, the station loomed in front of them, a brick building with a faded blue sign proclaiming its identity. Marks waved off his deputies and secretary, who were clamouring for his attention as he stepped out of the cruiser. He brushed past them with a terse nod, irritation flashing across his face. "You all can handle things for a few hours," he said sharply, his voice booming in the cramped space. "I can't be the only intelligent mind in the room." The air crackled with the unspoken tension of his command, and the deputies quickly returned to their work, the weight of their officers' glare keeping them in line. Marks strode into the station with purpose, his demeanour shifting from that of a weary cop to a man on a mission. Jeff followed, a mixture of apprehension and adrenaline coursing through him. Inside, Marks headed straight for his desk, rifling through drawers until he found what he was looking for. He pulled out a small plastic evidence bag, its contents shifting slightly as he held it up. Inside was the pocket watch, the very same trinket that had started this whole horrific journey. The metal glinted in the fluorescent light, a sinister reminder of the darkness they were facing. "Do you see this?" Mark said, his voice low and serious. "This watch has a story, and we're going to use it to flush this bastard creature out." Jeff's stomach dropped at the implication. "You mean lure it? But we don't even know how to stop it, Marks. What if it comes after us? What if—" The next question died in his mouth, leaving behind the bitter taste of a memory, one with his friend torn to ribbons. Marks turned to him, a steely resolve in his eyes. "We need to understand it, Jeff. Sometimes the only way to confront the unknown is to face it head-on. We can't sit back and wait for it to find us. We need to take the fight to it." The weight of Mark's words settled heavily on Jeff's shoulders. He felt the fear creeping back in, like tendrils of shadow reaching for him in the fading light. But deep down, he also felt a flicker of hope, maybe premature, but it was still there. If they were going to confront this ancient evil, they needed to be prepared. As prepared as one could be to face inevitable death. Jeff thought this is what soldiers must feel like, just after receiving fatal orders. As they made their way back to the cruiser, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Jeff's thoughts churned as he considered the implications of their plan. The Wendigo was real, and it was hungry. Once inside the cruiser, Mark started the engine, the rumble reverberating through the vehicle. "There's one more thing," he said, breaking the silence that was thick, short-lived. "I might have someone who can help us." "Who?" Jeff asked, his curiosity piqued again. "A local. Someone who knows the law better than anyone else that isn't affiliated with the tribe. If anyone has a way to help us, it's him." Marks paused, glancing at Jeff with an intensity that made his heart race. "But it's a risk. This guy doesn't take kindly to outsiders." Jeff swallowed hard, the prospect of confronting yet another unknown sending chills down his spine. "What do you mean?" "He's a self-proclaimed shaman," Marks replied, his voice steady, "and he's been through things that would make your skin crawl. At least according to him. And now I'm starting to believe him. But if we can get him to help us, he might have the knowledge we need to confront the fucker." With that, they pulled out of the parking lot and drove into the fading daylight, the sun a mere ember on the horizon. Jeff's mind raced as they navigated the winding roads, the trees towering above them like ancient living fossils. Each shadow seemed to whisper, and every rustle of leaves felt like an ominous omen. The world outside the cruiser was shifting, changing, as if the very fabric of reality was being warped by their pursuit. As they approached Mark's brother's house, the familiar silhouette emerged against the evening sky. A small, unassuming structure, it stood like a beacon in the gathering darkness. Lights flickered inside, casting a warm glow that contrasted sharply with the encroaching night. "Is this the place?" Jeff asked, his voice nervous and unsure. "Yeah," he replied, his heart pounding in his chest. "This is it." They pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the cruiser's tires. Marks glanced at the house, memories flooding back, laughter, family gatherings, the scent of his mother's cooking wafting through the air. But tonight, those memories felt tainted, overshadowed by the looming presence of mystery. Mark sat enjoying the chill of the AC. The silence that followed felt heavy and oppressive. Jeff took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. As they stepped out of the cruiser, Jeff felt a wave of cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and the shadows seemed to stretch toward them, as if beckoning them into the clearing before the structure. As the cruiser idled in front of the house, the feeling of trepidation deepened in Jeff. Remembering his words, he wondered how he would take to Jeff being a stranger. The way Marks had described him, he imagined an over-caffeinated doomsday prepper. He stood a few feet behind Marks, feeling like a ghost, an intruder in a world he barely understood. Marks approached the door and knocked, but before he could even take a breath, the door swung open. The figure that stood there was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face marked by years of hard living. But it wasn't the years that struck Jeff first, it was the gun raised to Marks's face, steady as a surgeon's blade, unwavering and unyielding. "Who the hell are you?" The man barked, eyes narrowed and fierce. "Easy there, Teddy," Mark said, his voice steady, though Jeff could hear the tension coiling beneath the surface. "That's no way to greet your brother." The seconds stretched into an eternity, and Jeff felt as if anything could happen in that moment. He could sense the history between them, a palpable tension hammering in the fact that two men had arguments unresolved and wounds unhealed. Just as Jeff thought the situation might spiral out of control, a laugh erupted from Mark's brother, breaking the tension like ceramic shards against glass. "Damn it, Mark!" Teddy lowered the rifle, a grin breaking across his rugged face. "You scared the piss out of me, you damn psycho." Mark stepped forward, and the two men embraced in an awkward, overly tight hug that felt more like a reconciliation than a simple greeting. Jeff watched the reunion with a mix of relief and confusion, trying to decipher the complicated emotions swirling in the air. "Let me introduce you," Mark said, stepping back from the embrace. "This is my charge for the day, Jeff. He's been through a lot, and I think his trauma may help us. He's witnessed something that very few have, and if my suspicions are correct, one that we've dealt with before. It has too many similarities." "Nice to meet you," Jeff said, extending a hand, which Teddy took with a firm grip. "You can call me Teddy," he replied, a twinkle of mischief in his eyes. "Come on inside. We can't have a family reunion out here on the porch, can we?" With a wave, Teddy ushered them into the dimly lit living room, where the scent of aged wood and something savoury wafted through the air. They settled onto a worn but comfortable couch, the fabric frayed at the edges yet somehow cosy. Teddy plopped down across from them, a casual demeanour masking the underlying tension. "Now, why the hell are you two here?" he asked, leaning back and crossing his arms. "This doesn't look like a social call. I didn't think I'd see my brother's face again after that last shindig." An unreadable expression crossed Mark's face, a mixture of guilt and suppressed anger. The air grew thick with unspoken words, and Jeff felt like an outsider, even in this moment of familial tension. "Look, Teddy," Marks finally said, his tone measured, "the past is the past. We should just leave it there." "Yeah, sure," Teddy replied, skepticism lacing his voice. "But it's hard to forget when you've got a brother who storms out like that. Not even a call. It's been 3 goddamn years. Can we not do this now?" Mark snapped, a flash of irritation breaking through his calm facade. "We need to focus on what's important." All right, Teddy relented, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "But you owe me a proper explanation later." Jeff, sensing the opportunity to steer the conversation, leaned forward. "We're here because we need your help, Teddy." "It's about the Wendigo." Teddy's expression shifted instantly from casual curiosity to focused attention. "The Wendigo? You've got to be kidding me." He looked over to his brother. "I've been trying to tell you for years this thing was coming back. You know me, when you told me I didn't take it seriously. Let's just say you have my attention now. I'll add that to my list of apologies later on, but for now, we need to call a meeting of the minds." Marks interjected. "We believe it's the same thing that happened a decade ago, that case with the 11 victims found mangled in the woods. All of their deaths occurred within a month." Teddy's brows furrowed as he processed the information. "And you think this is happening again?" Marks nodded, his expression grave. "We know it is. We've seen the signs, and now we know what we're dealing with." "Fuck," Teddy muttered, running a hand through his hair. "If you're telling me you know a way to stop this thing, I'll help in any way I can." "Good," Marks replied, relief washing over him. "We need to lure the creature to a place away from any population, just in case our plan goes south." Teddy raised an eyebrow, a smirk forming on his lips. "And I suppose you have a location in mind?" As if they were thinking the same thought at the same time, they both said in unison, "The titty." Jeff looked back and forth between the two brothers, confusion etched on his face. "The titty? What kind of name is that?" Teddy chuckled, shaking his head. "It's a local nickname for the island. It's shaped like, well, you can guess. A large circular patch of land with the biggest cluster of trees in the center. It's swimmable, but I've got a boat just in case." "All right, that works," Jeff said, nodding. "But how do we lure the Wendigo to her?" Teddy leaned forward, a glimmer of intrigue in his eyes. "I'm guessing you have a plan?" Marks retrieved the plastic evidence bag from his pocket, shaking it gently so the pocket watch inside jingled softly. "This might do the trick," he said, his voice low and serious. Teddy's gaze fixed on the bag and his smile faded. "You're not serious." "I am," Marks replied. "It's a relic of sorts. If it was a catalyst last time, it might just be the bait we need this time, too." "God, I hope this works," Teddy muttered, running a hand over his face as he leaned back against the chair. "You two are absolutely insane. But I like it. If you have any confidence this will work, you have my approval. We lost some good people to it the last time it fed. For a while I stopped believing. It's obvious now that it was a mistake. This must be the same thing as last time." "Maybe," Jeff added. "But we're trying to save lives here." "Right," Teddy said, his tone softening. "What next?" Mark stood. Resolve began to harden his features. "We need to get to that island before nightfall. It's our best chance to set our plan into motion." "Let's do it then," Teddy said, rising to his feet. "I'll grab some gear and we can take my boat. You just tell me what we'll need." In the backyard, a covered boat sat nestled under a tarp, its hull gleaming dully in the fading light. Teddy approached it with a sense of urgency, the tension between the brothers still palpable in the air, but lessened by several degrees. "All right, let's see what we're working with," Mark said, gripping the edge of the tarp. With a swift motion, he pulled it back, revealing a sturdy fishing boat with a small motor. It was well maintained, and Jeff could tell it had seen its fair share of adventures on the water. "Looks good," Mark said, nodding in approval. "We'll need to load it up with supplies." "Right, life jackets, gas, whatever we can find," Teddy replied, already moving toward the shed. "We're not taking any chances. And if you have salt in the kitchen, grab that too. We're going to need more. We'll worry about that later. Now, where's the hitch for this thing?" As the brothers worked together, Jeff stood back for a moment, watching the dynamic between them. It was a strange blend of camaraderie and unresolved tension, a dance of familiarity tinged with the bitterness of their past. "Hey, can I ask you something?" Jeff called out to Teddy as they rummaged through the shed. "Sure," Teddy said, glancing over his shoulder. "What was it that caused the rift between you two?" Jeff inquired, genuinely curious. Teddy hesitated, the shadows of the past flickering in his eyes. There were a lot of things, misunderstandings, choices made, and words said that couldn't be taken back. This topic was many of those said arguments. When he was doing his investigation those years, I came to him with this very concept, but it fell of deaf ears. He wanted nothing to do with this line of thinking back then. It's unfortunate this was his aha moment, but that's not what matters right now. We have to deal with this, once and for all. It's bigger than any of our problems, understand? "Fair enough," Jeff said, respecting the boundary. "But just know that whatever happened, it's not too late to mend things." Teddy nodded, an unreadable expression crossing his face. "Yeah, I get that. But for now, let's focus on what's ahead. My brother can be stubborn, even more so when he's put his head to something. At least this time it's mutually beneficial. We both lost people the last time this thing was awakened. I would like to at least prevent this from happening again if I can't avenge them." As they continued to prepare the boat, Jeff felt a sense of determination rising within him. They were on the brink of something monumental, something that had the potential to change everything. But the darkness of the Wendigo loomed just beyond the horizon, waiting for them to make their move. With the sun just a pinprick on the horizon, they had precious few minutes to prepare and hope for the best. Finding buyers that Teddy mentioned would be there, that was a small relief. With Jeff's help and the cannibalized wood from a produce pallet, they created a flotilla of surfaces they planned to anchor to land and drop behind them in the water. If the creature was reluctant to cross, they hoped this would provide a means for it to do so. As for salt, the industrial-sized bags they picked up on the way and softened salt Teddy had on hand they hoped would be enough. Mark stood at the shore, lowering the single engine into the water, then retrieving the tent spikes from one of its seats, wrapped in one large zip tie. Teddy looked skeptical at his brother's efforts to secure the rope attached to the buoys. "Need some help there?" he asked, but the officer ignored his offer and continued hammering. Jeff loaded the bags of salt into the boat, making sure the caps in the gas can were still secure. Confident everything was aboard, he stood there looking out at the seemingly still water. But he knew better. Lake Superior had some of the strongest currents in the Great Lakes. Maybe the creature was reluctant for the same reason anyone would be. To tread those waters was suicide. Maybe this whole effort was no different. What did either of these men know about fighting an entity such as this? But a hunger for some type of justice drove Jeff's motivation. His determined glare was soon met by the other two, who stepped up to either side of Jeff. But it was Marks who spoke. No backing out now. This is the point of no return. We don't have any day late to turn back now if we wanted to. Forward is the only path. I agree, Teddy said, stepping into the boat. Soon both joined him, and in no time they pushed away from shore and began throwing the platforms overboard in their wake. In less than 10 minutes they were across and standing at the shore of the Titty. Now let's hope this works, Mark said, void of any noticeable emotion. Jeff put out his palm. A small cylindrical piece of metal fell into it, the chain falling to rest on top of the heap. He opened it up, looking at the picture of the old lady, wondering her significance. Teddy looked over his shoulder into the face of the antique photo. You must have been its lover or mother, he mentioned before turning to remove gas cans from the boat. What about this Latin? Antoine pointed it out when he first opened it. Mark stepped up and took a look. It just means I love you. Jeff was surprised by its dull meaning. Doesn't sound like any summoning spell to me. Mark scratched the gruff on his chin. No, but look. When Jeff looked back down, the picture was drowned out by a bright illumination. He quickly closed the clasp. Light spilled out from the edges, as if an accompanying note to the strange beacon. Across the waters a banshee-like wail stretched across the water, reverberating off of every surface in the surrounding area and returning with a hollow echo. I think that did the trick, Teddy said, preparing to slice open one of the bags of salt. There's no time to waste. Come on, Jeff replied. Chapter 6. Confrontation. 20 or 30 minutes had drifted by since the wail of the Wendigo slashed through the stillness of the woods, a haunting echo that sent shivers down their spines. Jeff, Officer Marks, and Teddy had worked feverishly to encircle their makeshift sanctuary with a barrier of salt, the granules glimmering faintly in the twilight like a protective spell. The crescent moon-shaped enclosure was both a haven and a prison, a fragile bastion against the malevolent force that lurked beyond. With raw hands they had dug a trench, the earth yielding reluctantly as if it sensed the darkness they sought to contain. Inside that hasty grave, a thin river of gasoline glimmered, a volatile serpent coiling its way along the dirt, acting as a second line of defense. It was a desperate gambit, but they clung to the hope that the pocket watch Jeff held would serve as a beacon, summoning the creature to their trap. The floating platforms, a haphazard assembly of buoys and splintered wood, bobbed gently on the surface of the water, tethered to the soil by fraying ropes that creaked like the last breaths of the damned. Jeff's eyes darted along the line of makeshift islands, each one a fragile promise of safety, until his line of sight landed on the shore across the way. There it stood, an abomination birthed like the incarnation of the devil's worst nightmares, too many legs, too many joints, a grotesque parody of humanity. Its arms, elongated and misshapen, twisted unnaturally as it leaned forward, the canopy cracking within its grip, sending splinters flying like the last desperate cries of the trees. When it stood upright, haloed by moonlight, branch-like horns began to grow for either side of its head, branching off and growing to points as they erected from its skull. For Jeff, the sight was a cruel reminder of the horrors that had unfolded before. He could almost hear Antoine's screams, the sickening crunch of bone under the creature's claws, the blood-soaked nightmare that had ensued. James was gone, and Joel's death, his fault, just a result of a moment's distraction, clung to him like a shroud. The memory of crashing into that tree, of watching life slip away as he remained helpless, gnawed at him. It was a burden he would carry as long as he breathed, a ghost that would haunt his every waking thought. "Look! There it is! It's coming!" Marks's voice sliced through the fog of his thoughts, pulling Jeff back to the present. The Wendigo advanced with a stalking grace, each careful step taken on the floating platforms, their buoyant surfaces betraying no sign of its monstrous weight. It was a creature born of malevolence and hunger, and yet it moved with a deceptive lightness, as if the laws of nature itself had bent to accommodate its presence. As the creature traversed the makeshift bridge, Jeff felt the pocket watch in his hand, a cold talisman that tethered him to reality. The brass was chilling against his palm. Marks had his service revolver drawn, the barrel gleaming ominously in the twilight, while Teddy held the rifle he had brandished hours earlier, knuckles white with tension. The Wendigo paused, its many eyes glinting with a predatory intelligence, and Jeff could feel the gaze of the creature boring a tunnel into his deepest thoughts. Nestling in his brain like a cocoon, ready to hatch dark larvae into his skull cavity, he fought the intrusive wave of thoughts and visions, associating them with their source. As if the thing could hear his thoughts, the thing stopped midway on the bridge. 1,000 teeth were revealed, as if its smile was a pair of decrepit curtains being drawn. They had prepared for this moment, but now, as the creature inched closer, each heartbeat sounded like the tolling of hell's bells. The men steeled themselves, adrenaline coursing through their veins, ready to confront the darkness that had come to claim them. A symphony of voices, familiar yet alien, came forth from the creature's jagged mouth, turning to demonic laughter as it traversed the remaining planks. The Wendigo was halfway across the makeshift land bridge, its grotesque form gliding over the floating platforms with a fluidity that belied its monstrous appearance. Officer Marks, heart pounding in his chest, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, a leaden shroud focusing his aim. He steadied his breath, clenched his jaw, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the gunfire shattered the air around them, the bullet tearing through and finding its mark on the creature's twisted flesh. The report echoed off of the trees with a reverberating bang. The Wendigo lunged forward, propelled by an unnatural force, its long limbs stretching out. Marks barely had time to react. He shifted his stance just in time to dodge the swipe that would have surely taken his head off. The creature's claws grazed the air where he had just stood, the force of its movement reminiscent of a panther. It crashed into the ground, the impact reverberating through the earth, but it was already poised to strike again. This time its gaunt, hunger-driven gaze zeroed in on Teddy, who was frantically firing round after round from his rifle. Each bullet struck the creature in its flank, yet it seemed unfazed, its hunger eclipsing any pain. The beast turned its attention fully to Teddy, snarling with a malevolence that made the air shimmer with hatred. Mark's heart racing and instincts firing on all cylinders, squeezed off another round, the bullet finding its way into the back of the creature's head. The Wendigo faltered, its body going slack as it dropped to the ground, sliding to a halt at Teddy's feet. For a moment there was a haunting stillness, the kind that precedes the storm. Teddy, wide-eyed and trembling, took a step back, his rifle trembling in his grip. After a few agonizing seconds, he poked the creature with the end of his gun, expecting it to be lifeless. Then it happened. With a sickening grace, the Wendigo's twisted hand plunged through his stomach and out his back. Clutched within its grotesque grip was a pulsating organ, his heart. Teddy stumbled backward, horror etched across his features as the creature withdrew its hand from the gaping wound, still clutching the beating heart. The Wendigo brought the organ to its mouth, taking a savage bite, blood splattering across the ground like a macabre painting. It tossed the remaining piece of the heart into the water, the ripples distorting its reflection. Teddy fell lifeless to the grassy terrain. "Get back!" Officer Marks screamed, reloading his pistol, eyes wide with defiance. He fired again, each shot a desperate plea for survival. In that chaos, Jeff seized the moment. Driven by a primal instinct to survive, he darted out of the salt circle. The barrier that had once seemed like a sanctuary now felt too fragile against the encroaching horror. The Wendigo seemed invigorated, its gaze shifting back to Marks, who was still scrambling for safety. "Look here!" Jeff shouted, brandishing the pocket watch, its cold brass gleaming in the dim moonlight. The creature halted, its many eyes locking onto the watch, momentarily distracted by the glint of its surface. In that split second, Marks fished out his Zippo lighter from his pocket. The small flame flickered to life, illuminating the darkness, and he dropped it into the trench of gasoline. With a whoosh, the fire ignited, flames licking hungrily at the air, creating a barrier of heat and light. But the Wendigo was not finished. It lunged towards Marks, dagger-tipped fingers digging into the flesh of his calf as he began to run. Pain shot through him and he gasped, struggling to break free from its terrifying grip. Jeff, desperate and fueled by adrenaline, scrambled towards the boat, grabbing the remaining gas can. He ripped off his t-shirt, wrapping it around a piece of wood left over from the bridge's construction, soaking it in gasoline until it was well saturated. "Marks!" he yelled, his voice terrified and pained. As the creature tugged at Marks, the officer fought to free himself, but the Wendigo was relentless. With a burst of courage, Jeff lit the makeshift torch, flames roaring to life as he charged at the creature. He swung the flaming wood with all his might, smacking it right into the Wendigo's face. The impact was so fierce that it cracked the wood, sending splinters flying, but the monster recoiled, its shriek piercing the night. Marks managed to break free, scrambling toward the salt circle as Jeff dropped the charred remains of the wood. They both dove for safety, using an already sliced-open bag to seal the circle behind them. The flames danced within their makeshift prison, illuminating the creature's twisted form, which now regarded them with palpable contempt. It prowled around the edges of the fire, its eyes glinting with fury and hunger. Jeff, heart racing, could feel the weight of the pocket watch in his hand. He took a deep breath, contemplating the significance of the timepiece. It had been a tether to the past, a reminder of lives lost and the fragile line they walked between sanity and madness. In a moment of clarity, he raised the watch high above his head. The flames flickered, casting eerie shadows around them. "This ends now!" he shouted, and with that he tossed the pocket watch into the circle of fire. Time itself seemed to pause as the watch tumbled through the air, a glint of brass against the inferno. It landed in the center of the flames, the fire enveloping it in a swirling embrace. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, a stillness hanging heavy in the air. Then the fire roared to life, expanding and twisting as if it had a will of its own. The flames surged upward, casting a brilliant light that illuminated the entire area. The Wendigo shrieked, its voice a cacophony of rage and despair as the fire consumed everything within. The air grew claustrophobic with heat, and a wave of energy pulsed through the ground, reverberating like the throbbing of a heartbeat. The creature recoiled, its form blurring as the flames reached out, licking at its gaunt frame. "What's happening?" Mark shouted, eyes wide with disbelief. "I don't know, just hold on," Jeff replied, his heart pounding in tandem with the inferno's roar. As the flames intensified, the Wendigo's form began to shift and flicker, caught in the throes of the fire's wrath. It howled, a sound of pure agony that echoed through the night, echoing off the trees and into the very depths of the land. The Wendigo's limbs twisted grotesquely, its many eyes wide with realization as the flames began to consume it whole. Its bellow was like that of a scorned demon. It clawed at the air, trying to escape the inferno that was now its prison. But it was too late. The outer salt circle did its job, binding the creature within the circumference. With one final earth-shattering roar, the Wendigo was swallowed by the flames, the fire dancing hungrily around it. The heat surged, pressing against Jeff and Marks like a living entity. Then, with an explosion that sent shards of light and heat cascading into the night, the creature was gone, reduced to ashes, drifting away on the wind as if it had never existed at all. They stood in stunned silence, the echoes of the Wendigo's cries fading into the night, leaving behind only the crackling of the fire and the heavy weight of what they had just witnessed. The salt circle, once a flimsy barrier against evil, now felt like a sacred space, a testament to their survival. Is it really over?" Marks asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Raspy from smoke inhalation, and Jeff's reply was pretty much the same. He nodded slowly, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "I think so. I think we did it." But deep within him, a part of him remained unsettled. The horrors they had faced were not just physical, they were woven into the very fabric of their being. The memories of the Wendigo, the loss and the darkness would linger long after the flames had cooled. Together, they stood in the remnants of the night, the firelight casting long shadows against the trees, each of them forever changed by the darkness they had faced and the light they had fought to protect. A frigid northern wind moaned through bare tree limbs as the small gathering laid Teddy Marks to rest. His reported demise in Superior's murky depths was a necessary lie to conceal the true horror. Jeff attended quietly, reliving the gut-wrenching sacrifice that ensured the forest's safety. Both men knew no search would recover anything from that secluded patch of unholy land. Marks's leg still wounded him, 4 angry claw marks, a badge of the evil lurking unseen past the tree line. But Teddy's brave act ensured it would remain there, fueled forever by the blaze consuming its hellish form. The service dispersed into the gloom, leaving Jeff with the sergeant upon the barrow. "I'll have the motel cover your stay while this mends. Then we'll make our report. Blame the others' ends on a rogue bear as best we can." Though their hearts carried private scars, relief bloomed that Paradise's folk need not live in fear. Each sought solace in their own way from the grim tasks necessity demanded of good men. But the forest secrets was safely returned to the shadows, and for now, that was enough. Until the unfortunate day when someone would eventually find the pocket watch. The creature's essence was safely stored back in the earth. And hopefully, with the help of the salt circle, it would remain that way until the end of time. The end.